Welcome back, everyone. We're about to jump into The Mandalorian, a show that's taken the galaxy by storm. And you know what? We're going deeper than just Beskar Steel and Baby Yoda this time. We're talking articles, reviews, even a podcast episode, all to figure out why this show resonates so much with fans.
It's intriguing, isn't it, how it captures that classic Star Wars magic, but also carves out its own identity. A tough thing to balance, but The Mandalorian pulls it off.
It really does. And you see that right off the bat in this New York Times review we've got here. They highlight the whole Western vibe, even comparing it to those classic Jon Ford films, which honestly is a comparison you hear a lot with this show. But then, get this, they point out something kind of surprising. Ready for this? The show is quiet.
It's true, especially when you compare it to the grandeur and the soaring orchestral scores of some of those other Star Wars films. Those moments of quiet, of contemplation, they actually work to ratchet up the tension, allowing the visuals and that atmosphere to really sink in.
Right. It's like you said, adds a layer of realism that you don't always get in these big sci-fi epics.
Exactly.
And speaking of visuals, this Wikipedia article we dug up talks about this revolutionary stagecraft technology they used. You know, the volume. And this isn't just for us tech nerds. This is game-changing stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Groundbreaking. Instead of relying on green screens, imagine this. The actors are surrounded by these massive LED walls that project these incredibly realistic environments, and they do it in real time. So, picture this. When Mando's trudging across some desolate planet, Pedro Pascal, he's actually seeing that desert all around him. He's reacting to the light, the scenery, everything.
That is wild. It's like they literally brought those alien worlds right there onto the set. No wonder the show feels so immersive, so real.
Exactly. It's incredible.
And of course, we can't forget about the heart of the show. Mando himself, and obviously the adorable Grogu. Now, this podcast episode we came across, it's from a fellow Mandalorian fan, and they perfectly captured that feeling, that instant connection with Grogu.
Yeah, they really did. And it's something that resonated with so many fans. You see this adorable little enigma, and it just tugs at your heartstrings. It's impossible to resist.
Oh, totally. I mean, those eyes.
Oh, yeah.
Come on. But before we get totally lost in the cuteness overload, let's talk about the man behind the mask for a sec. The podcast hosts, they rave about Pedro Pascal's performance. And for good reason, right? To convey that much emotion with just your voice and those subtle head movements, that takes some serious acting skills.
It really does. I mean, to make us feel so emotionally invested in Din Djarin, even though we barely see his face, that says a lot about Pascal's talent. And it plays into that classic Western archetype, too, the strong, silent type.
Totally. Now, this podcast also dives into all those theories about the Mandalorian's identity, which early on, there are a lot of those floating around. But luckily, we've got the Wikipedia article to set the record straight. His name, Din Djarin.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder that while it's fun to speculate, to get caught up in those fan theories, it's also important to separate that from what's actually confirmed in the show.
Absolutely. But now, speaking of digging deeper, this is where it gets really interesting. Get ready, because this Artur YouTube video, it throws us right into the deep end with this concept of the samurai gunslinger. Talk about a mashup.
It's like Sergio Leone meets Akira Kurosawa, but in a galaxy far, far away, right?
Right. And it's not just a cool name, this samurai gunslinger thing. It goes way beyond the surface. This Artur video, they really dig into how it's woven into the very fabric of the show.
Oh, absolutely. It's more than just a visual style. It's baked into the themes, the characters, everything.
Right. Like you think about classic Westerns, you've got your lone gunslingers, those wide open landscapes, that sense of frontier justice. But then you bring in those samurai films with their codes of honor, their stoic warriors, those epic battles, and somehow The Mandalorian manages to blend those elements together seamlessly.
Exactly. Like those old samurai films, it's about duty, it's about honor, even when faced with chaos.
Yeah. You really see that contrast in the show between the lawlessness of the Outer Rim, where it feels like anything goes, and then you've got Din Djarin, bound by that strict Mandalorian creed.
Oh, it's such a clever parallel, right? You've got the Outer Rim, this wild frontier teeming with bounty hunters, smugglers, you name it, all vying for power. And then amidst all that, you have the Mandalorians, these remnants of the bygone era, clinging to their traditions, their code. It's like they represent this fading ideal in a galaxy that's constantly changing.
It's true. And speaking of fading ideals, this whole concept of the fading myth, it's something the Artur video really digs into. They draw this link between the decline of both Westerns and samurai films in popular culture and the changing world we see reflected in The Mandalorian.
It's a fascinating point, isn't it? I mean, think about it. These genres that once held so much sway over audiences, they've kind of faded from the limelight a bit. And in the show, you see the Mandalorians scattered, almost forgotten, clinging to the old ways in a galaxy that's rapidly moving on.
Right. It's like they're trying to hold on to who they are in a galaxy that's trying to tell them to change.
Absolutely. And the video poses this really thought-provoking question. Can these old ways, these ancient codes, can they truly survive in a world that's constantly evolving?
Right. I mean, it's a question that resonates even outside the show, don't you think? Like,
Yeah.
it makes you think about our own world, how traditions and values change over time.
Absolutely. It's like the show is holding up a mirror to our own relationship with the past, with tradition, with how we navigate a world that's in constant flux. And one way they actually visualize this idea, and they point this out in the video, is through this recurring visual motif, the open stage.
Ah, those wide, sweeping shots of vast landscapes, so characteristic of Westerns.
Exactly. They're stunning, but they also represent this world on the brink of transformation. And if you pay attention, you'll notice how those open stages start to shift as the show progresses, giving way to more industrialized, more urban settings.
It's true. It's like that sense of limitless possibility starts to shrink as the galaxy becomes more connected, more technologically advanced.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's there. The wild frontier is being tamed, and with it, a certain way of life is fading away.
Such a powerful metaphor, isn't it? This tension between tradition and progress, the struggle to hold on to what's important in a galaxy that's constantly trying to pull you in different directions. And that brings us back to Mando's journey. It's interesting because when you look at it through the lens of all these sources we've got, the review, the podcast, it's art to order video, it's like each one adds another layer to his story.
It's true. Like we're piecing together a puzzle, and each source is a different piece that helps us see the bigger picture. And at the heart of it all is that classic hero's journey, but with that signature Star Wars twist.
Right. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in the podcast. It's about finding that balance between the familiar and the new. Mando, he's a bounty hunter, he's a lone warrior, he's got that classic Western archetype down pat. But then the way his story unfolds, the choices he makes, they subvert those expectations in really interesting ways.
It's true. You think you know what to expect, but then The Mandalorian throws you a curveball.
Yeah.
And one of the most compelling aspects of his journey, and this is something the Arthur video highlights really well, is his evolving relationship with Grogu. I mean, talk about subverting expectations, right? He starts out as just another bounty, another payday, but then something changes.
Right. That connection between them, that bond that developed, it's so central to the show's emotional core. And again, it speaks to that idea of finding family, finding connection in the most unexpected places, which I think is something we all crave, even if we don't always realize it.
It definitely is. It reminds us that even in a galaxy far, far away, even amidst all the action and adventure, it's those human connections, those moments of empathy and compassion that really resonate.
Absolutely. And you know what else adds to that emotional resonance? The music. I mean, our podcast host, they couldn't stop raving about the soundtrack.
Oh, and for good reason. Ludwig Göransson, he knocked it out of the park with this score. I mean, it perfectly captures that blend of influences we've been talking about. You'll hear those Western motifs, those sweeping orchestral pieces, but then he'll throw in these electronic elements, these more modern sounds, and somehow it all works.
It's so good. It's so evocative, so emotionally charged. It really adds another layer to the viewing experience. But I think it's time we zoom out a bit. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here, the Western and samurai influences, the whole concept of the fading myth, Mando's personal journey. But I'm curious, what do you think it all means? Like, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, what is The Mandalorian really trying to say?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think, like any good story, The Mandalorian is open to multiple interpretations. But one thing that really resonates with me, and it's something that Artur video touches on, is this idea of finding heroism in unexpected places. I mean, this isn't your typical superhero epic, right?
Definitely not.
No.
Mando, he's not out there saving the galaxy. He's not fighting in some grand war.
Exactly. He's just trying to do right by this little foundling who's come into his care. He's trying to navigate this complex galaxy one step at a time. And in doing so, he discovers something about himself. He rediscovers his own humanity.
That's a really interesting point. It's like, in a world that often celebrates these grand gestures of heroism, The Mandalorian reminds us that sometimes it's the smaller acts of courage, of compassion, that truly matter.
Yes. It's about defining your own "this is the way." It's about finding your own purpose, even when the world around you feels uncertain. And I think that's something we can all relate to, regardless of whether we're bounty hunters or not.
It's true. And there's another layer to this whole idea of unexpected journeys, and it actually comes from the art tour video itself. Remember how they draw that parallel between Mando's journey and the narrator's own unexpected 1,000-mile road trip?
Oh, yeah. That personal touch was really effective, wasn't it?
It was. And it really drives home this idea that sometimes life throws you curveballs. You get thrown off course, and you have to learn to adapt, to find your way through the unknown.
It's that classic hero's journey, but grounded in a way that feels relatable, even in the context of a galaxy far, far away. And I think that's what makes The Mandalorian so compelling. It's a story about resilience, about adaptation, about finding your own path, even when you don't know where it's going to lead.
And you know what's interesting? They actually share this quote in the video from Jon Favreau, the mastermind behind it all. He talks about how storytelling, at its core, it's about passing on wisdom, giving us tools to navigate the world.
It's true. Think about those ancient myths, those stories that have been passed down for generations. They teach us about courage, about resilience, about facing our fears. And The Mandalorian, even with its spaceships and blasters, it taps into that same timeless power of storytelling.
It does. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so special. It could have easily been all about those big, epic battles, those lightsaber duels, but instead it chooses to focus on those smaller, more intimate moments, those character-driven stories that feel, I don't know, more human, more grounded.
Absolutely. And it's those moments that really stick with you long after the credits roll. It's about those connections we make, about finding your tribe, your sense of belonging in a galaxy that can feel pretty vast and indifferent sometimes.
That's true. And that's something I think we can all relate to, that need for connection, that search for purpose, for something bigger than ourselves. And The Mandalorian reminds us that even in a galaxy filled with all these extraordinary beings, sometimes those most human stories are the ones that resonate the most.
I completely agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into The Mandalorian, we're left with a show that's so much more than just a space western. It's more than just a nostalgia trip. It's a story that speaks to something deeper within us. That desire for connection, for purpose, for finding our own way in a galaxy that's constantly changing. And hey, who knows, maybe there is a little bit of magic left out there in the galaxy after all, just waiting for us to discover it. This is the way.